Well, welcome back. This is the final message of 4 messages that I had originally shared in homiletics class when I was in undergrad school. Homiletics means preaching. And in the degree program I was in, we had to take 3 semesters of homiletics. And for this month, I just decided to choose 4 messages out of the 12 or so that I presented in those various classes. So this is the final one. And this has been kind of fun for me to look back on what I did when I was in my early 20s and then take those messages, update them, make them a little bit longer, because most of the time we were speaking for 5 to 7 minutes in those classes. So here we are, the final one. Next week, I'm going to start a series about Jesus because it's the final month leading up to Easter. So we're going to have 4 weeks of just looking at various aspects of Jesus the man, who he was, what he was like. And hopefully that will be a fun, informative, and at the same time inspiring series. Well, when I was in undergrad school, of course, I had to take classes like freshman English. So even though I was studying for ministry and took a lot of Bible and theology and also some practical classes like administration and supervision. Now that title alone, that really grabs you, doesn't it? You just wish you could have taken that class. It really wasn't as bad as the title seems, but it was all about administering the life of a church as a pastor and supervising staff and other people. But in freshman English, one of the books we were assigned to read was titled In His Steps. It's a classic work of fiction about a church in a small town where all of the people decide that they are going to live their lives as closely to the way Jesus would have lived as they could. So with every decision, they're always going to ask themselves, what do I think Jesus would do? You might remember some years ago, people were wearing these wristbands that had WWJD, what would Jesus do? And the book, In His Steps, was all based on that premise. And it was an interesting book for a bunch of freshmen to read. Of course, we all tried to adhere to the principles in the book, but the thing I found is that when you ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Your answer is going to be impacted by the way you see Jesus. For example, in our lives, 21st century in the United States, where I live, if you think that Jesus would be a Republican and it came time to vote, you'd always vote Republican. If you think Jesus would be a Democrat and it came time to vote, you would always vote Democrat. If you think Jesus would never participate in politics, then you might decide not to vote at all. So how you answer that question, what would Jesus do, is really impacted by the way you see Jesus. How do you see that man, Son of God, teacher, rabbi, a miracle worker? How do you see him? What's your image in your brain? And so that's going to impact the way you make that decision. And starting next week, we'll be looking at some of those things. What was Jesus like? Well, a few years later, while still in undergrad school, another book came out that was titled How to Know the Will of God. And oh, we loved that book. We all grabbed it. We wanted to read it because we wanted to know God's will and wanted to know how we could know God's will. And of course, we were all looking for a magic formula of knowing God's will. And after finishing the book, I was so disappointed because there was no magic formula. Knowing God's will is not as simple as a magic formula. There are some things that we know without even asking. We know, for example, God does not want us to murder someone. That's a given. God does not want us to steal. That's a given. We also know God does not want us to be greedy. That's a given. So there are some things we know without even asking what is God's will. But of course, as we were in our 20s at the time, we wanted to know specific details, like who should I ask out on a date, and then where should I take her? Knowing God's will is not always an easy thing, and we see that in the Bible as well. In fact, a couple of examples of people trying to discern God's will. Think about Gideon. Gideon was a judge. His story is in the book of Judges. And Gideon was trying to discern God's will in a particular situation, so he used a fleece. And so he set a fleece out. A fleece was the fur from a lamb or sheep. And he decided one night he would pray, okay, if you want me to do this, make the ground wet but not the fleece. And then the next night it was make the fleece wet but not the ground. And that was how he was going to determine God's will in a particular situation, even though there was no instruction anywhere about using a fleece to determine God's will. Move forward a bunch of years, and you've got the apostles after Jesus ascended into heaven. There were 11 apostles left, and they decided they needed to fill that 12th slot that was vacated by Judas Iscariot when he committed suicide. And so the thing that they did was, in essence, it was the same as if you and I would throw dice to try to determine. And that was going to tell them God's will about who to choose to fill that slot as an apostle. Well, it's kind of interesting that they would do that. They like Gideon were trying to discern God's will. It's not an easy thing to do. But we do have a hint of something that will help us. In Romans chapter 12, the first 2 verses, therefore, I urge you, in view of God's mercy, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve. Some translations say discern what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. You want to know God's will. Well, Paul, in writing to the church in Rome, gave them an idea. I wouldn't exactly call it a magic formula, but he gave them an idea, and that is the first step in knowing God's will is to have your mind renewed so that in essence you think like God thinks. And over the years I've heard a lot of suggestions as to how to have your mind renewed. One, of course, is to read the Bible. I've had a lot of people suggest memorizing passages of the Bible, something I've done. And then taking those passages, meditating upon them, because as you do that, you're thinking about what's good and what's bad. You're thinking about the subtleties that come with making decisions in your life. So to renew your mind is, in a sense, to get your mind thinking in different patterns rather than in the old patterns. And so he was speaking to largely new Christians when he wrote this. People that had been raised a certain way, they'd been taught certain principles, they'd been taught certain values. And so he's saying, renew your mind. You renew your mind by offering yourself as a living sacrifice, which was a play on words for Paul. Because at the time, the temple still existed, and in his culture, they offered animal sacrifices as an act of worship to God. But Paul is saying, offer yourself as a living sacrifice. A person who's going to continue living, but you're offering yourself up and saying, okay, God, use me. Some years ago, a musician named Scott Wesley Brown wrote a really funny song titled, Lord, Please Don't Send Me to Africa. And in the lyrics, he says, "Oh Lord, I am your willing servant. You know that I have been for years. I'm here in this pew every Sunday and Wednesday. I've stained it with many a tear. I've given you years of my service. I've always given my best. And I've never asked for anything much. So Lord, please, I deserve this request. Please don't send me to Africa. I don't think I've got what it takes. I'm just a man. I'm not a Tarzan. Don't like lions, gorillas, or snakes. I'll serve you here in suburbia, in my comfortable middle-class life, but please don't send me out into the bush where the natives are restless at night. Please don't send me to Africa." That was always one of the fears of a lot of people that with whom I went to school, was God suddenly going to pluck them out of their comfortable life in the United States and make them missionaries in other countries. Well, the friends of mine I have who have been missionaries love that life. They are called to it. And for them, it's not the same level of sacrifice. So when you say, "God, I'm all yours, use me in any capacity," doesn't mean you're automatically going to end up in Africa or some other country. That's a special calling. That goes to people that have that particular calling. But he says to offer yourselves as living sacrifices, and that's kind of a step, or that is a step towards renewing your mind. Because suddenly you're not living for yourself. You're living in the way God wants you to live. But you have your mind renewed, and you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. That you, as a thinking, reasonable human being with a significant level of wisdom, you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. Go back a bunch of years, I had been working in what's called a parachurch ministry for many years in the Jesus House in Cincinnati. And then I was offered an opportunity to join the staff at College Hill Presbyterian Church, leading their singles ministry and their college ministry. Well, for me, that was a big step. College Hill was a church I respected. I knew of some of the staff there, and knew a couple of the staff pretty well. I'd been there to speak and sing at different times for different groups. But the idea of going on staff at a church, that was a huge switch for me. I didn't know if I would ever work at a church. And I certainly didn't see myself as a pastor of a church. Not then. I've been doing it for years now. But that time I was offered that opportunity, I went in for an interview. I had a great interview with the team there, and they called me to let me know, "Hey, you're our choice. Take a couple days and think it over," because I had not really applied for them. I won't tell you all the details right now, but it came through a phone call. And so I was thinking about it for a couple of days, and I happened to be at a record store one day. Remember those? Peaches Records and Tapes out by Northgate Mall in Cincinnati. And as I was checking out, I knew most of the people who worked there just from going in quite a bit to buy records, to buy cassette tapes. Remember all those things? But the woman working at the counter that day had become, kind of a friend. And she said, "Hey, what's up? What's going on? What's new?" And I said, "Well, I was just offered an opportunity to go on staff at a church in College Hill Presbyterian, leading their singles ministry and college ministry. And I want to make sure I'm making the right choice, and I'm not sure whether or not I should do it." And she just stopped. She looked at me and she said, "Well, of course you're going to do it." And I was so startled by her response. Now, at the time, she was not a Christian. Later, she became a Christian. In fact, she became a Christian. She got married, and she and her husband came to College Hill Presbyterian and got involved there. But it was so amazing to me as I thought about it later that here's this woman, a friend, someone with whom I have a cordial relationship, just as a customer, and yet her immediate response was, well, of course you're going to do that. And I did do that, and it was the right choice, and it was an opportunity that God opened for me, and it was a great opportunity to be there. Therefore, I urge you, in view of God's mercy, which you've experienced in your life, offer yourself as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve. You will be able to discern God's will, God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. Who are the beloved? Go and be the beloved.